Today, the ideas we're going to be talking about are ideas of democracy. Democracy seems to be under radical reinterpretation at the moment. The pundit class, I think, often describes populism as a threat to democracy, but populists, they are really deeply steeped in the language and the rationales of democracy. You only have to listen to about 5 minutes of a J.D. Vance speech to see that. And from their view, the populist view, the principles that oblige government to behave in a certain way, that's the problem. You know, parliament, the legal system, the bureaucratic state, the thing we're going to think about harder today. They force government to be non-player characters. That's their perspective. And that's sort of the way in which we're going to contextualize Project Chainsaw, the projects of Javier Milei, Elon Musk. They're wielding the chainsaw in the name of democracy. If you've listened to any of the speeches, that's their rationale. So there's something interesting happening there. And even here, closer to home, the Prime Minister last week, when he abolished NHS England, a bureaucratic structure, part of the state, did so in the name of democracy. Now, people on the other side, progressives, liberals, they have the complete opposite view. Those principles that oblige government to behave in a certain way, they're a good thing. They're checks and balances on executive power, and that, for them, is the very essence of democracy. It's a control on bad decision-making. It limits the abuse of power. And from their perspective, the real threat to democracy today, in 2025, is rising authoritarianism. Societies are becoming less free. Authoritarianism, restrictions, and crackdowns are not just increasingly common, they're increasingly popular. One of the defining characteristics of our age is surely the rising appeal of authoritarians. So what's going on? We're going to try and get to the bottom of some of that today. And to help us do that, we have this excellent panel of speakers here with me to think about what's the bigger threat to democracy today: authoritarianism or the big bureaucratic state. Next to me is the Right Honourable Sir John Redwood, an eminent thinker associated with the Conservative Party. He served as the director of the No. 10 Policy Unit under Margaret Thatcher, and then a cabinet minister in the major government. Next to him is Polly Toynbee, columnist at The Guardian and a very influential commentator on the Labour Party. Next to her is also another Polly Mackenzie, who is the Chief Social Purpose Officer at the University of Arts, London, but was also the Director of Policy to the Deputy Prime Minister in the coalition government. And last but not least, at the end, is Professor Ben Ansell, whose title, I think, sort of captures the essence of this entire debate. He's a Professor of Comparative Democratic Institutions at the University of Oxford, and gave, not last year's, but the year before's BBC Reith Lectures, where he talked about our democratic future. So, John, I'm going to start with you. What's the bigger threat to our democratic future? Authoritarianism or the big bureaucratic state?
I don't like either of those, and they're both threats to democracy. I think the real topic of debate is the rise of the populist movements. A few years ago, I wrote a book called We Don't Believe You, and it prophesied that on the continent of Europe, the Christian Democrat and Social Democrat duopoly parties, which were still in some cases in full control and others were waning, would all be swept aside because it was very clear that they were getting way out of touch with what their electorates wanted in two major areas. The first was economic lack of success. The Maastricht austerity economics was clearly going to damage people's perceptions and depress their living standards. And then the mass migrations, and that was clearly going to upset a lot of people who felt that they were not helpful to building prosperity and the kind of society they wanted to live in, and that's exactly what has turned out to happen. I wasn't sure what would happen in the United Kingdom. It now seems that those two pressures are also destroying two major parties in the United Kingdom. We saw the electorate do a very good demolition job on the Conservatives last summer, and we now see Labour down in the polls to about the level the Conservatives managed to score in the last general election, with a large number of people making it crystal clear that they have no love of the offerings of either of the major parties when they've been in office, because they feel let down. And I think this is where the so-called liberal elite, with their great institutions and this framework of international rules, misread around half the electorate or more. Because I think what we saw was in the West, over COVID and beyond, three independent so-called central banks, the American, the European, and the British, destroy their economies with wanton money printing and ultra-low interest rates extended for too long, created a great inflation, and of course then dismissed the governments that were holding the reins at the time. So in America, the Democrats had to go. In the United Kingdom, the Conservatives had to go. The French government had to go. The German government had to go because they were destroyed by the great inflation that so annoyed people. And people also don't like the moral and intellectual superiority of the people who run these institutions, who think they're above accountability, and then give you the wrong answer. And the banks, the three Western central banks, were telling us that the inflation was not their fault. It was Putin's invasion of Ukraine and higher energy prices that had done it. So I wrote a study of the leading central banks of the world and pointed out that the Chinese central bank, the Japanese central bank, the Swiss central bank did not bloat their money supply in the way the Western banks did. Their inflation stayed around 2% throughout the Ukraine war period, and they are, of course, even bigger importers of energy than the three Western areas were, and they were having to pay the full prices. And the inflations in the West were considerably higher before the invasion. I mean, in the United Kingdom, inflation hit 6% before Putin invaded, so it was already 3 times what was permitted. People then across Europe and in America felt very let down by the large migrations. In Britain, we're a very generous and open society, and we do believe in helping people who are fleeing danger and civil war and so forth. But to invite in 750,000 people a year on a sustained basis was asking too much. And it wasn't even fair on the people we're inviting in, because if you want 750,000 extra people to come and live in Britain, you need to build 3 cities the size of Southampton to accommodate them. And it's not just that they need plenty of housing. You can't keep pouring people into ever smaller bits of housing in London at ever higher rents. But they need all the other facilities. They need the surgeries, the hospitals, the schools, the bigger sewers, all the other things you need to have a civilized life. And government didn't get around to putting any of that in. And so the public, a lot of them, were saying, I can't get a surgery appointment, the waiting list is too long, I can't get into the school of my choice, housing is through the roof, having to pay far too much for a very small share of a flat or whatever. And they saw the connection that the elites couldn't see. So this is why you get these huge gaps and huge frustrations. And on the continent, we're now at the point where in some of the countries, we're on to the 2nd or 3rd generation of populist parties, because in, say, Greece, Syriza gets in, lets everybody down, so then they have to be destroyed, and you have to find a replacement for the populist party that's gone wrong. It'd be very interesting to see how Meloni gets on in Italy. Now, I think you wanted me to comment on chainsaws. I don't favour chainsaws, and knowing my own limitations, I wouldn't trust myself to handle a chainsaw, because I wouldn't want to end up minus an arm in a fit of absent-mindedness. I think you need experts to use chainsaws, and you need them only for really big things that are suited to them. But I do think that Millet was right, that he had to make dramatic reductions in the amount of public expenditure in Argentina, because the country was bankrupt. It was living through a hyperinflation. Inflation had reached 200%, and the sky was the limits. It was becoming impossible to lead a normal life there, because your money devalued between the time that you got paid and the time you managed to get the shop to try and buy something. It's a really dreadful situation to be in. And he has now balanced the budget, and he has now got inflation down to 2.2% for the month of January, still quite a high rate, but massively reduced on the monthly rates at the worst of the crisis. So in exceptional circumstances like that, you probably need to take dramatic action. I don't think Musk is going to make a huge impact on the size and scale of the American government. He is, after all, only an advisor, and you need executive power to be able to do that, and it will hinge very much on what the executives in the leading departments and independent bodies decide they can do. And it will also, in some cases, require congressional approval, because if you wish to remove bodies, you normally need some change in the law, and it would be very wise to observe the niceties of employment law and to understand when you take over a government, they are all your employees, and you need to treat them well and to manage it properly. I think in both the case of the United Kingdom government and the United States government, wishing to slim the size of the administrative state, it would be best to do it by natural wastage. You can then shed 7-8% a year without any particular pain, and you ask people who stay working for the organization to be more flexible over which posts you continue and which ones you fill, and the bright ones see that it actually gives them more opportunity, because it means that only people already employed can get the promotion.
John, I'm going to give you about 30 more seconds.
So I think that would be my advice. I'm very happy to stop there and see where the debate goes.
All right, thank you very much. Can we ask questions now or at the very end? Questions come after each panel's had a crack at their opening remarks. Is that okay with you? Yeah. Okay, fine. Polly, I'm going to come to you, Polly T. John sort of gave an explanation and part of defense of modern-day populism, sort of defined and understood in one particular way. But are we right to call it populism? Is it better described as authoritarianism?
I think it's both. I think it's one leading to the other. I think we are at the moment at a time of the greatest peril. I mean, the seismic shock of what's happened in America, of finding that they are no longer what has been for all of our lives the sort of bedrock of democracy, of democratic principles, that the sort of worshipping of the American Constitution, for all of its faults and everything else, never there it was, the great empire that was essentially trying to be the force for good, trying to spread democracy, often in misguided ways and places, but nevertheless, that they were there, and they were there to defend European democracy too, and the values that America had sprung from. And to find all of that dismantling, to find that the American president actually prefers Putin to European leaders is so frightening that I think none of us have quite really got our head around what that really means. I mean, unless he suddenly retreats and changes his mind, unless Putin plays it so badly, but it looks that way, and it's deeply alarming. It's, you know, it maybe sound apocalyptic to talk of end of the Roman Empire or end of the Roman Republic. We're thinking, you know, Diocletian and Caligula and Nero, and we look at what's happening, what Musk is up to if he really does have the power, which he seems to be being given at the moment, and what Trump's happened yesterday. The outright, this may really blow up, so the outright defiance of the courts, that you can have the US border czar saying, I don't care what judges think, when the judge had told him not to deport 250 Venezuelans. I mean, of course, it's as you say, it's a good subject for them. They couldn't have a better battle than on the question of migration, legal and illegal migration. So it may quite suit Trump to find himself impeached yet again for defying the courts on this particular issue. It'd be unfortunate if that turns out to be the case. We have to hope that the Trump mania collapses in on itself. But it's by no means certain. I mean, half of America support him. I think that you know, we saw a taste of it with Boris Johnson, proroguing Parliament, lying to the Queen. He felt he would do anything really, but just about our checks and balances pulled that back. But it doesn't mean it would always be so. I think Nigel Farage is a very dangerous man. You know, charming, blokey, pint and a fag. He has a lot of the same political genius that Trump has too. I mean, Trump is a political genius. He's no kind of policy genius, but he just has the ability to capture people in an extraordinary way with those great rambling speeches. And Farage has the same thing. But he is only a one-man party at the moment. may not last very long, but I think it's quite a genuine threat. And I think our electoral system makes it much more frightening that we have a government now that was elected on under 34% of the vote with over 60, whatever it is, 4% of the seats. That can happen very easily. Farage could do that. A third of the people and 2/3 of the vote completely command. And our system, our system does allow absolute dictatorship of a prime minister with a large majority can do whatever he wants. I sometimes wish Starmer would realise this more and be a little braver. For instance, changing the electoral system, which he could just do if he wanted to. I think what we saw, Brexit was, you were one of the revolutionaries, was a great populist revolution, an explosion. And a lot of it centred around the immigration question, which, as you say, is a real problem for every country in the world, how to cope with this. We don't have obvious answers as yet. My suspicion is that Europe will toughen up on its asylum rules, and that the European Convention will be changed to make it much clearer who is and isn't an asylum seeker. One thing to be a leader of the opposition, and another just somebody who happens to be in a war zone. But we'll see if that happens or not, but it may become necessary. But I do think we mustn't underplay the danger of the times we live in. You look at the oligarchy, you look at Bezos and Musk and Zuckerberg, and you look at their command of the media. Well, we've always been used to it in this country. I mean, Murdoch owns 40% of the media in this country, of the newspapers. And newspapers are still powerful online. It turned out they didn't die, they just migrated. The Daily Mail, the Telegraph, we've always had over 80% of the media in this country commanded by a small group of press barons of the far right, not like sort of Christian Democrat owners of newspapers in Europe, but far to the right, living abroad, don't pay taxes here. So we're used to coping with that, but it happening in America is particularly alarming to see them lose their liberal media in a big way. I haven't offered any solutions. I've just said, we must be very wary, and we must look to Europe, and Europe must look to itself. We need to rearm, we need to protect each other, we need to close ranks. We need to be in there as close as possible. Trade becomes a minor issue compared with the rearming of Europe. And in that is the hope, because we may be the last bastion of the kinds of democracy that we believed throughout my life, I believed was inevitably spreading around the world. Turns out not to be so.
Thanks. Polly Mackenzie, you've worked at the heart of British democracy and you've thought a lot about how it could work better. What are the solutions?
Hello, everyone. So, oddly enough, this is the second event in a month that I have done with Polly Toynbee. And I think that there should be more politics, right? Like, I have this sort of fantasy podcast called Politics with me and this Polly and maybe Polly Vernon, who writes in Grazia, because she's basically more fun than us. And you think, right? Yeah, I think we agree. I know, but I've never met Polly Vernon. So if anyone's got an intro, I'm up for it. So I used to run this think tank that's obviously not quite as good as IPPR, but actually better, called Demos. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about the word demos, and partly because my dad was a classicist. Also, my dad, super fan of Polly Toynbee. Super not fan of John Redwood, sorry, John. In fact, my mum used to tease my dad that I had been named after Polly Toynbee. But I was not. I was named after my great-grandmother, who was called Focalture, but known as Polly, which is apparently a Dutch thing. I don't know. Anyway, so what was I talking about? Oh, so Demos. Anyway, my dad, who was a classicist at university, would insist that I call it Demos. I'm like, we're not Greek, it's fine, I can call it Demos, it sounds better. Anyway, so I used to run Demos. Democracy. What is a demos? right? I think this is critical to all of our thinking, because John has talked about the ways in which populism is, in lots of ways, like it sort of feels like a democratic instinct. It's not, oh, I'm Nigel Farage and I want to just tell everyone what to do. It's actually a story of being engaged with what people want. But, of course, the problem with people, and there's 70-ish million of them in the UK and several billion around the world, is that they're a bit different from one another. And so actually getting what I want is quite different from getting what we want, right? What we can agree on is quite a different transaction than getting what I want. And some of you will know about, there's this nice, annoyingly tall chap called John Alexander who's written a book called Citizens, who argues that the solution to all of our problems is us, but particularly argues that we've got lost in a kind of consumer story. And I think our politics has got lost in a consumer story, which is fundamentally transactional, which is that and it's go back to sort of Blair era, I will send you a text message promising that you as an individual can have extended licensing hours or whatever, the right to gamble or a thing. But of course, democracy is about the demos or the demos, depending on your view. And that's a collective noun. It's a we. And humans are weird things. Now, I, like many women of my age, namely in their 40s, are a bit more chubby than we would like to be. And this is because we have two competing thoughts. One is that we would like to be thin and glamorous and beautiful, and the other is that we really like cake. You're feeling me, right? And humans have you can call it Daniel Kahneman style, you can call it thinking fast and slow. You can think of it as the ego and the superego, if you're a bit more Freudian about it. You can think of the little angel on this shoulder and the little devil on this shoulder, if you want to think more Warner Brothers cartoon. But humans are weird and complicated, and they don't have simple views about what they want. We are deeply altruistic and deeply selfish. I remember getting sort of lost in a little TED talk sort of intellectual bubble for a bit, where there was this one woman who was talking about how she was a sort of sociologist of bonobos, and saying that really fundamentally what you need to understand about humans is they're exactly like bonobos, and if you don't know anything about bonobos, they basically they indulge in shared masturbation to build social rituals and bonding. And there's other group of people who are like, no, to understand human society, you need to understand that we're fundamentally evolved from chimpanzees. And what do chimpanzees do is that particularly the males, they bond together and they brutalize others and they bash each other to death. Right? Both of these things are existent in the human mind and the human mentality. And the idea, I think, of a democracy rather than, I don't know, come up with a stupid neologism, an iocracy, right, is that it engages with the idea that there might be something that we can agree on which is slightly different from what I want for me. And the problem with this, that I think neither populists nor bureaucrats nor autocrats, none of these people are really engaging with, is that requires us to build a we. And perhaps 1,000 years ago this was easy because we all did the same things and we all kind of looked a bit like each other. And the human instinct, homophily, which is different from homosexuality, but homophily, which is simply to just like people who are a bit like you because they're fun to drink a glass of wine with or eat cake with, is a kind of problematic part of the human instinct. And I don't know if you noticed, but there was this sort of weird debate between J.D. Vance and Rory Stewart, right, about what does Christian philosophy say? Does it say that you should love your family best, or does it say that you should love strangers and, I don't know, Samaritans best? It seems to me that, again, because the human instinct has these poles, is that part of what Christian philosophy is saying is that because our instincts are to love our family or the people who are like us best, we actually need to force ourselves through the mechanism of whether it is a religion or a superego or a society or a law or, I don't know, an institution, to force ourselves to think differently and to think beyond whether it is a kind of about they talk about seventh generation governance, or talk about a larger us, a wider sense of the people who are like us. And it seems to me that what is missing from populism really is a sense and a commitment to build an us that is capable of making those trade-offs, and that is capable of saying, I might not get what I want today because we are more important than I am. And bureaucracy is also very bad at that. And I think the bureaucracy has been captured by a sort of transactional story of what the state is for, is that I will give you what you want. It's about a purchase kind of transaction that happens at the ballot box. And this is just not actually possible. It is massive, massive over-promising of the state. And what's really depressing to me about this sort of story of missions, the idea of there might be a collective, a we solution of what we might go after together as a nation, combining the power of the state and of private enterprise and of civic society and of individuals putting in their hard graft of the extra hour or the extra minute in their community or in their society, is all of that's been lost, and it's turned into a bunch of milestones that the state will deliver for you. And no wonder people are disappointed in the state when the state is promising it will take all of their problems away, when that is literally impossible, especially when the problems exist beyond the boundaries of the individual and they exist at the we level. And so if you want to have democracy, and I think we assume, because you've come to this event, frankly, you probably think that democracy is a good thing and worth saving. And it's really not just about saying, oh, well, I don't want autocracy or I don't want bureaucracy. It's actually, I want democracy, and that requires there to be a demos or a demos, and that requires us to think really quite radically differently about each other and about our own obligations to each other. And what we need is a political discourse that doesn't anymore talk about that ego version, which is there absolutely in populism, of I want what I want, and I want it faster, and I want it with a chainsaw. Instead, a super ego version, thinking slow about what we want and how we might need to be patient in order to get it.
Thanks, Ben. I'm going to come to you at the end. So to try and put some of that into context, into the long view, a lot of what Polly just spoke about there hits at some of the fundamental tensions between majority rule and the common good, between public citizens and private individuals. I know you think about that stuff a lot.
Thanks, Path. Ben is a much more boring name than Polly, so I don't have any good stories on that. I do have a book though. Well, I don't have a riff on that though, Polly. So we'll see. Democracy as a word. The thing I like most about democracy as a word is for more or less the first 2 millennia after its coinage, in people either talking about ancient Greece or ancient Greeks describing themselves, depending on who you read, it was viewed as an insult. You called someone a democrat as an insult to them because, well, if you'd read your Aristotle, democracy is one of the bad systems. It's a rule of the many that leads to tyranny because it becomes the mob. And so for a very, very long period of time, if we were having, in this room, if we were having autocracy or bureaucracy, we'd be like, yeah, those are both better than democracy. But we live in a very different world now. We live in a world obviously created by the American and the French revolutions, where democracy no longer was a slur. But even then, if you think about the kind of great characters of the French and the American revolutions, they depict two of the tensions that Polly and John and Path have mentioned, those tensions between populism and technocratic rule. So on the one hand, you have a kind of Robespierre view of the virtuous people with a true voice. He'd read his Rousseau. Rousseau didn't get to build a guillotine and chop the heads off people who disagreed with the popular voice, but Robespierre nonetheless had a very populist view of what democracy would look like that sadly he never got to fully enact. And then across the pond you had James Madison, our other kind of point of thinking about democracy, where people couldn't be trusted. There was no such thing as full agreement. There were factions, and so the best thing you could do was to set them against one another with checks and balances. Now, we've been dancing that dance, essentially between a Robespierrean view that, well, look, there's basically a public will out there, and the job of the state is to truly represent the demos in that way, and a Madisonian view that you can't trust anybody, and the best thing you can do is basically set different institutions up side by side so they can elbow each other in the stomach if they get too far out of line. We've been dancing that dance ever since, and I think we are still dancing it today. The irony is that Robespierre was a man of the left and Madison was a man of the right. And the institutionalists, as we've been talking about, are now of the left. They want to protect the set of liberal constraints that we have. They want to protect our electoral system. They get very upset about Boris Johnson proroguing Parliament, proroguing the establishment. It was the left that was upset about that. Today in America, the left is understandably very concerned about Trump rolling over as many judicial constraints as he can on a given day. And we have a populism of the right. But in a way, it's still the same dance, but with a different partisan tinge. But maybe we're not quite sure how to handle what that contemporary politics looks like. But both of those are still democratic impulses. I mean, Parth, you set out quite nicely that populists aren't necessarily anti-democratic. Where I think they become anti-democratic is if they can't get what they want. And then, so I'm just going to read out, because I'm an academic, I brought a book with me. It's a book from 1992. Imagine that. A book on democracy, and by John Donne, who's still alive, still a member, fellow of the British Academy, very great Cambridge political philosopher. But this chapter is by the Harvard historian Charles Mayer. And it was titled, it's an easy title, Democracy Since the French Revolution. So Mayer's he's just summarizing everything that happened between 1789 and 1992. I just want to read out his point about what happens when populists become upset with democracy, because I think it has some interesting parallels. So I'll sort of do a quick excerpt. So in the last analysis, so the new rightist critics maintained, democracy failed because it was a regime of useless discussion and insufficient action. If no compromise were possible, discussion was misplaced. Action by audacious minorities was crucial. The turn of the century brought a longing for such decisive minority currents to offset the languor and indolence of democracy. Male action, whether conquering African wastes, competing at the Olympic Games revived in 1896, making cavalry charges in Third World Wars, planning revolution, returned to fashion after a generation of pacifism. The quest for an élan vital pervaded philosophy and glimmered as a personal orientation. Now, any of you who've read Curtis Yarvin or somebody like that, the kind of dark Enlightenment thinkers of the right in America, will recognize a lot of that desire for action, the masculine energy that a certain social media leader has been talking about. So those kind of parallels to that type of language, but really a dissatisfaction with politics as discussion, a populism that was concerned that there wasn't enough action, would simply decide to seize the action rather than worry about what the people had to say. I think that's a concern that we should all have about what is occurring in America right now. And in a way, it's a dissatisfaction with both Robespierre and Madison. It's certainly a dissatisfaction with checks and balances, right? I mean, dictators do not like checks and balances. That's almost definitional of autocracy. But there's also a dissatisfaction with populism when the people don't give you the answer that you want. And my concern is we're teetering a little bit there at the moment. If you think about a country like Turkey, the main rival to Recep Erdogan, who's been in charge for a very long time, Imamoglu, the mayor of Istanbul, the main possible presidential rival, the University of Istanbul just revoked his degree today. Why would they do that? Well, in order to run for the candidacy of the party, the opposition party, the CHP, you have to have a degree. That's the kind of autocratic behavior that we obviously want to avoid, that men of action, like Erdogan, like to engage in. And I think that's the real risk we need to keep in our sight. I'll stop there, Paul.
Thanks, Ben. And tolerance does increasingly feel like an antiquated virtue. Right, I think we'll open up questions. We will open up for questions. Pop your hand up and I will come to you. John is changing to a seat that is closer to the ground.
Something more comfortable.
I know what you mean. I sort of feel like I'm hovering up here. Okay, well, we've got one hand, so we'll start here.
So this starts with a point of information and then ends on a question. Okay. So point of information. John, it was under your government that the money supply, or the amount of money... So I'm starting with point of information, then ending with a question. So John, it was under your government that the money supply, or the amount of money, began to outpace GDP, the real economy. You talk about the great inflation and the role of central banks, but QE really only served to legitimize the actions of commercial banks back in the lead up to 2008 and onwards. Do you accept that it's both commercial and central banks that are responsible for what you coin as the Great Inflation?
Well, first of all, it wasn't my government. I was fairly critical of that government, and I decided not to stand again at the general election. On the issue, yes, some money growth does require commercial banks to advance large quantities of the money created by the central bank. But I think you have to see that in that period when the central bank in Britain created 450 billion pounds and made that available through the banking system, that was bound to cause trouble. And the main reason we had the inflation was that central bank decision. They didn't have to create that much money.
At that point, commercial banks has already created £1 trillion.
I'm gonna intervene here. John,
Yeah, but in
John,
response to the bank's action, and that's the point of studying what happened in Japan and China and Switzerland, where they didn't create the extra money in the central bank, they didn't create the fiat money, and so they didn't get the commercial bank response.
Thanks.
I agree, they relate to each other.
I suspect the two of you can have this out at drinks upstairs.
It started with an electronic money in the Bank of England, which then went into the commercial banks when they bought the bonds.
John, I'm gonna intervene you. Let's go to the lady back there with her hand raised quite high. I think there's a microphone coming to you, otherwise just shout. And I should have said, just if you want to introduce yourself before you ask the question, but you don't have to.
Thanks, Ruth, anonymous civil servant. We won't talk about chainsaws. My question is about whether you think that Morgan McSweeney's view on the fact that delivery might stem the tide of populism is something with which you as panelists agree. There has been some discussion about the fact that governments haven't delivered, and so people are turning to people who profess to be able to deliver, and whether you think that delivery on 5 missions, regardless of what you think of them, will be sufficient to stem the tide of populism, particularly in the context of a system of misinformation, which I feel like we've touched on but not really gotten into. Thank you.
Okay, excellent question. I'm gonna start with you, Ben, and then come back round. Is delivery the antidote to populism?
Yeah, and that's why President Kamala Harris is succeeding so well. No, Biden thought that deliverism would work. Well, the Biden team, actually the economists around Biden, who, funnily enough, all came from Elizabeth Warren's crew, they really believed in that policy would produce its own support. I mean, that can happen. Political scientists have studied Social Security, the American retirement system, for years, and that created its own lobbying base. So that can work. But the thing is, it has to happen really quickly. And the problem that they got into with the CHIPS Act, with the IRA, and we say the IRA in this country, the Inflation Reduction Act, that IRA, the problem they got into is that it wasn't shovel-ready projects. And even if you have a shovel-ready project, it's not just the construction you need the outcome associated with that construction afterwards. I've written on my Substack this a number of times. I was very nervous in the summer that nothing was happening and that the strategy of the government at the time was to sort of appear next to the British public like a doctor next to a sick patient, saying, "Oh, that's terrible. You're very, very ill. Awful stuff," and then just sort of leaving the room. We'll have to sort this out with some really horrible treatment. Leeches first, without saying, "Okay, what are you going to do to improve the situation?" Now, I do think there's been a big change on that front. Morgan's chainsaw has come in. If Morgan is indeed the person briefing about chainsaws, who's to say? I think that's probably salutary to the extent that nothing was happening, or at least was perceived to be happening for 6 months. The danger now is that we've shifted to the other end of disruption for disruption's sake. And I don't think that the public are going to thank Labour for lots of disruption without policy outcomes either, right? So the excitement about action might motivate a Curtis Yarvin of the world, but it's not going to motivate the public. They don't just want to see you doing something. They need to see the outcome, and all of that needs to be happening a lot faster than it currently is.
Populism, I'm going to come to you because I know you write about this quite a lot in a fair few columns.
Yep. I mean, I think it's one of the great disadvantages of democracy is that it takes such a long time to do things, and an election comes up before if you can build 1.5 million houses, well, maybe you can. If you can do all those growth projects that Rachel Reeves has put forward, this is for growth, 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 can you get that done in the next 4 years so that people see it and know it? I think those things are very difficult. And yet investment is what this country desperately needs. It's the right thing to do, but it doesn't necessarily mean that, you get the benefit of it. Maybe the next government does and it's not you. I think what will be very important in terms of delivery, and was in America, was basic cost of living, cost of eggs. And, what they got wrong in America was that although, GDP had gone up, it didn't reach people's pockets. You can get great statistics, you can show that there is growth. Whose growth, they said. And it has to be everybody's growth so that they really feel it. I think there are things this government will do. I mean, I'm absolutely sure that the NHS will be looking in much better condition. In 4 years' time, the numbers are already coming down. They've already more than fulfilled the numbers of extra appointments that were in 1 year. They've done within 7 months. There are things they can do. Again, will people feel it? Will they know that their local GP, it's easier to get an appointment, that their aunt or grandmother is closer to getting an operation? It's very easy, I think, to sit up in Whitehall and see it all in terms of the big numbers, which is what Biden did so well with the economy in a big way and growth in a big way, but just forgot to ask people how they were actually feeling.
Yeah, I sometimes wonder about sort of this making democracies deliver approach, because I mean, if we're making the case for democracy on the sense that it gives you better wages or better public services or more affordable homes, that works in fair weather conditions. And then when things are going a bit shit, then democracy's out with everything else. And Polly Mackenzie, you think about sort of democratic reform quite a lot, in addition to sort of making public services better. Do we need something more to counter populism, a constitutional reform agenda?
I think it's just... I'm fascinated by the questions of government delivery and different models, and I could sort of talk for ages about missions and barbarism and Georgia Gould, and I'm not going to, because what troubles me is that all of the intellectual firepower, which might actually be able to think differently about how to turn the machinery of government more successfully, might turn out to be completely insufficient. Because what's fascinating about Trump is that he was a terrible president, right? And I don't mean because I'm broadly progressive and I don't like the stuff. He promised to build a wall and close the border with Mexico, and he just catastrophically failed at that. And so it's weird that we're sort of stuck on the sense of deliverism as the answer, when this guy who progressives don't like was re-elected not just on the basis that Biden's deliverism failed, but that seemed to not be what people wanted or expected. And in a way, I think there's so much of a disconnect about people's expectations of what the state might do for them, that almost having somebody who seems to want to be on your side and back your corner is more important than somebody who might get a little 5% increment in whatever, something counterfactual, I can't really tell. And that's really depressing to me. It was depressing to me when Boris Johnson was elected, a sort of sense that we'd rather have somebody who's fun than somebody who can do anything or I don't know, read the basics. I think he can technically read, just to be clear. I just mean read perhaps the documents in his box. But something that's how low our expectations are. It's more important to have an entertainer than a deliverer. And so we might end up putting all of this energy and time and effort into will there be milestones and will there be delivery, and there's a KPI and we said we'd do this thing. And, I worked for the Liberal Democrats for a really long time, basically a decade. And we did not do so well in 2015. And that is not because we did not have a record of delivery and a promise of more. And that is a Lib Dem slogan, by the way. Just goes on all the focus leaflets, record of delivery, promise of more. and we got loads of lists. And I was there, I was in government from 2010 to 2015, and when I meet my maker, I will be proud of what we did, of the changes we pushed for and the changes we prevented. And I have no doubts that that was a much better government than the ones that followed, and that it was better because we were in it than because we weren't. And yet no voter gave the slightest crap about that, right? They were just like, yeah, sod you, tuition fees. It's something about politics, and I think I like to think that it's something to do with actually our obsessive over-promising about what the state can do on behalf of people, because actually it's really very little. We overpromise, we underdeliver, and then as a result, everybody loses faith.
John, politics as society now practices it. Is it different to how it used to practice it?
I think there are a lot of similarities, and I'm surprised nobody has yet mentioned the word honesty. I think what really annoys so many voters is that all the major parties make promises and then they don't carry them out. And sometimes it's because they get blocked or it turns out to be more difficult or events change, but sometimes it's just that they destroy them and decide to do something completely different for no good reason at all. I mean, Liberal Democrats, the one promise everybody remembered from the 2010 election was there wouldn't be tuition fees going up. And then I think the Conservatives offered to Vince Cable the choice of having the junior Conservative minister handle the policy and announce it, and I think they'd even have allowed the Lib Dems to not have voted. But Vince volunteered to tear up his own promise and to thrust it down everybody's throats. Not surprising.
I so want to have a fight about this, but I'm not going to.
That was destructive.
Thank you.
And then the Conservatives endlessly promised to control migration and failed to do so, and people got really fed up with that, and they could have controlled it. And in answer to Polly, it's not mainly illegals and asylum seekers we're worried about. That's relatively small numbers. And the bulk of the 750,000 come in legally. And it was a conscious decision of successive governments to invite in a lot of low-paid labour to keep wages low and to meet the requirements of big business that thought it'd be easier just to employ foreigners on the cheap rather than investing and training and creating more worthwhile jobs and putting more machine and computing power behind the people in the way that I think we should do. And that is what the people wanted. So they got fed up with the fact that the major parties didn't understand this and didn't do it when they had the opportunity. So I think it matters fundamentally for a party that wants to get re-elected that it sticks to what it's promised and it behaves in a predictable way. I mean, I'm very much in favour of this Labour government wanting to explore how we can re-engineer the British public sector to make it more efficient, to raise the productivity, and I think that does mean higher quality jobs, more interesting jobs. It means fewer jobs, and I would do that by natural wastage, but I think we need to get in there with all the tools of successful HR and personnel management and all those other things which are so lacking in the dreadful way we mislead and mismanage the public sector. But I also think Labour has to be very careful with its brand, because I really don't think taking money away from disabled is a terribly good look, and I'm not sure that today is going to land very well.
Thanks. Let's do a few more questions. I'm going to take a handful at a time now because we will run out of time. Okay, well, mic's been passed to someone. Yep.
Hi, Anshul here. I work in finance. So I have a question for all of you, actually, in the sense that how much of an impact do you see of social media in the rise of populism? For example, I understand democracy is a slow work in progress. The changes will take time to come in. The way we see is people's patience, people's essentially tolerance of change has gone down with social media as well. Do we see probably that being an impact too in their expectation? Again, same thing, Biden did a lot of good things, probably a bad things, but in terms of IRA, et cetera, the stuff that he bought in, CHIPS Act, et cetera, they were something that could have made an impact. But the perception, social media, and again, one more point being, social media by structure is designed to amplify negative emotions, FOMO, that fear, et cetera, et cetera. So how does that play a part in?
Okay, thank you. Can you pass the mic to the woman just in front of you in the green jumper? Just right there.
Hi, My name is Eliza Lockhart. I'm a research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, but in my prior life, I worked for the chairperson of the Australian Electoral Commission. And when I look back home, I can see that populism hasn't taken quite as great a hold as it has in other democracies. And that's not to say that populism doesn't exist in Australia, it's definitely there. But I think there's a great extent to be said that our electoral systems and frameworks are acting as a certain level of protection against its sweeping to the extent that it has in the UK and the US. And so I'm curious as to whether you think it's not necessarily a question of whether populism has taken over sort of the population of other democracies, but whether the electoral systems in those democracies have failed to prevent that rise.
Great question. Another one, I'm going to come here. Okay, well, we're going to take a handful because we're going to run out of time. We'll do one more round of questions after this.
Hi, I'm Tarek Aboushali. I'm a political scientist at Oxford. I was wondering if we, by focusing on populism, do we not miss the main point? If we really look what's happened in the US in the past couple of weeks, if we look at the FPÖ in Austria, the AfD in Germany, populism is neither their core appeal, nor is it what they want to do when they're in power. It's really very obviously authoritarian nativism, and in the US, it's really fascism, that the ideology is probably closest to properly describe, that there is this democratic core left that is clearly in populism. Are we not missing what they actually want and why they are successful? And are we not providing a euphemism for who these political actors are?
Okay, a series of great questions. I'm going to direct them at the panel. Ben, I'm going to start with you, I think. Has social media moved politics space from reason to reaction?
So I think I've been asked this question loads of times for the last 2 or 3 years, and all the time I'm like, oh, you know, William Randolph Hearst, the Spanish-American War, the media has always influenced people. And every time I do it, I'm less confident because I do think that the algorithmic spiraling into the rabbit hole that is going on, if you look at more complicated and extreme views, then it becomes quite hard to claim that this doesn't matter in some way. I think the problem with social media is that it's atomizing. And I do think what we've lost in politics, and John will have had experience of this, I'm basically saying you guys are older, and I'm really sorry I'm doing this, but the unions were an important way of intermediating people's views, of collecting people's views. The church was an important way of collecting people's views. Conservative associations, which had many members, they were the water cooler of their day, right? This was a place where well, John's shaking his head, so that's interesting. I think that the media environment is so targeted at individuals and sends them off in their own place that we've lost some intermediation from that. And I'll see if people can disagree with that.
I think that's a very good way of putting it. Can I take up the electoral
I was going to come to that.
I think one of the ways not to deal with populism is to lock it out and to say, you know, we have an electoral system that doesn't let you in, you know, for the first time ever, I think, the Lib Dems actually got their due, but it hasn't been the case before. And the fact that Nigel Farage got 5 MPs, well, it's 4 now, is an insult, and people feel that. And people feel that about Westminster. You know, people who aren't necessarily very, well, what could I do? Could I start a party? Could I do... You just said, not a chance. You'll be mowed down. I am a veteran, a wounded veteran of the Social Democratic Party, and we tried it, and we were murdered. And we got, you know, within an inch. But the system absolutely prevents new arrivals. And I think one of the most important reasons for advocating proportional representation is actually to say, yes, Nigel Farage would probably have 70 seats or so. He'd have his fair due, and then people could see what they were like, they could hear their arguments, and I think on the whole, the other parties would see them off. But I think suppressing them is not the way.
John, proportional representation, yes or no?
I've always been against proportional representation. I like single-member constituencies where a single individual with the most votes is elected. It's a straightforward, easy to understand system. Extremely difficult making MPs accountable if they're elected by various proportional systems, because they don't have that direct identification with single place. And I say that after my party that I was part of just got slaughtered by the system, but that's the way it works, and they should have done better and been more popular. I do find all this business about populism being so reprehensible quite extraordinary. Surely in a democracy you want parties that are popular. And if some new parties emerge that happen to have a better balance of opinions and policies that more people like, you should welcome that. You shouldn't be terrified of them.
But John, there's a reason why they're different words, right? Popular, populism,
well,
they
I think
end
they're
differently because
related.
they mean different things.
No, they're related. And if you then immediately say that anyone who belongs to a new party that's challenged your old party is a fascist, then that's just abuse. Most people are not fascists. And there are now very large voting blocks voting for these populist or popular parties, nor are they necessarily all right-wing. I mean, indeed, I think some of the most successful populist parties mix the two. Not always a blend I would like, but I mean, quite a lot of them, for example, do socialist economics and traditional right-wing controls on migration as a mix that they think might be quite popular. You shouldn't stop experimentation with parties, but I think it's much better to have a first-past-the-post system which can normally deliver a strong government. And again, I'm quite happy that we've been delivered a strong government. That's the way the system works. I can't complain about that. But I can point out that it didn't have much popular support, and therefore I think it needs to be an awful lot more careful about what it does, and it shouldn't take it as having a mandate for some of the beliefs of Labour Party MPs if they want to survive. And the art, surely, of having won a big mandate but not having popular opinion behind you is to use your strength in Parliament to build strength with the public in the country, whereas in the first 8 months this government's done the opposite. It's done so many things that have annoyed the 2/3 plus that didn't vote for.
I think he's certainly not interested in the democratic and constitutional kind of integrity of the United States. I think we're going through absolutely an extraordinary crisis that forces us to rethink our conception of the West and frankly seek safety in numbers in Europe. You know, this is the realignment of 80 years of history, and something we thought was, I think Polly was talking earlier about that sense that some stuff we just thought was fixed is not fixed. And you know, whether that involves spending more on guns and less on disability benefits or putting up taxes, you know, those are small decisions in comparison with the fundamental question as to whether to redefine the boundaries of you know, that kind of coalition of allies who believe that liberal democracy is the right way to run things. It's just got a lot smaller.
Well, what about the radical right in Europe? Marine Le Pen, Alternative for Deutschland?
Well, I mean, it's the difference between popular and populism, right, is that populism eats itself. There's a reason you cycle through, and we've seen it in, somebody was talking about it earlier. Was it you? Yeah. Is the problem with promising impossible things like a wall between the US and Mexico or to put up the birth rate, is the impossible things can't happen. And so you've therefore got two options. One is to go, yeah, sorry guys, I was rubbish. Or the other is to like create an enemy story, which is usually foreigners or possibly somebody further away. In order to defend, and that's fragile, which means that there's always a newcomer. And actually, until we start to find a way to have a politics that talks to people about actually the boundaries of the possible, you will always be vulnerable to people who are promising the impossible. I genuinely don't know how we deal with that, but that is what is happening. It's what's happening with Trump, and it is all-consuming and massively destructive, and we actually don't we really don't have an answer yet.
Okay, we're going to do
Sorry.
one final round of questions. We'll come to the man who's got that huge smile on his face.
That can only be me. Thank you for a really interesting talk. One thing that it's helped to do, I think, is show the agenda as being either, you're on one or two sides, you are either populist or you're either progressive on a spectrum. I am blessed to be father to two amazing children. How do you think that the generation born 2010 onwards will look at and vote on the kinds of issues that you've been talking about? And I suppose the point I wanted to make is, we talk to them a lot about this stuff. They have said, and please don't laugh, that they think would be better off run by artificial intelligence than by any kind of human. Are they right?
Okay, great question. The lady at the back there.
Hi. You were talking about, there are two poles. It's either you're altruistic or you're selfish, and then there's this fight between the two. And I just want to make a comment to say that evolutionary, we are all inherently selfish. Even when we seem altruistic, we're being selfish. And of course, would like to have a narrative that suggests otherwise. But when we think about democracy, is it not really about what prompts people to vote, but more about making sure that they feel heard, and yes, we deliver? And I also think that when we always look at this authoritarian figures, there's a snobbery towards them, but perhaps we ought to be more aware that they're talking to the average person, and when politicians stand up there, they should be trying to win the trust of the people and not having some sort of, giving the people some sort of feeling as though they know better, and that whatever their concerns are isn't well thought of or does not take into consideration how complex the system is. And as he said, democracy is about, trying to keep dictatorships away from the system, right? Trying to stop that happening. So we do need people who...
I think we understood the essence of the question.
Okay.
Thanks. We're going to go to the back row there. I'm going to take 4 questions and pose for one. Each panelist gets 1 question, though.
Yeah, thank you for such an interesting debate. I'll be quick, kind of building on the gentleman's question, but selfishly for my generation. You spoke about a period of flux, but I'm 28 years old, right? And for the last 10 years of my adult life, Brexit, Trump won, this debate between populism, autocratic state, it's been my entire adult life for how politics is. So how do we move forward when this state of flux that we seem to agree that we're in and we don't really know how to move forward has been the state for the last 10 years? And I think there seems to be a lack of acceptance that this is actually the reality that we're in. And yeah, how do we move forward from that? Thanks.
Cool. I've got the unlucky task of... I think I have to go to that gentleman because he's almost touching the ceiling.
This is a slightly flippant final question, but we've heard a little bit about bureaucracy, a little bit about autocracy, and we've sort of touched on democracy and whether it's the same as populism or not. I feel like we need something new and something better and something different. So what would be the key tenets of polyocracy?
Okay. All right. I can only take 4 questions because I'm going to let the panelists pick the ones that they want. There was a question about the kids all right? Are we inherently selfish? We're stuck. Is there a future for anyone? And this thing about polyocracy. I'm gonna start with you, Polly. And the rule here is you pick one of these questions, get to answer it. The last panelist will have to just roll with the question that's left. All right, I'm gonna start with you, Polly Toynbee.
Okay. What's about the young? Very phony poll came out the other day saying, some large proportion of them thought democracy was the wrong way to go. And talking to pollsters about this, those polls are totally misleading. Because if you had a conversation with those people, you'd say, okay, so what happens if you get the leader say to them, how do you get rid of that? Oh, is it not working? Hello. How do you get rid of that leader? Then they immediately understand that you have to have a system of getting rid of the people who are in power. I am optimistic about younger generations who've been brought up in all this turmoil. I also think it's quite wrong to think that we are by nature, by evolution, selfish, the selfish gene. To put that into a political context is quite wrong. We are social animals. We only thrive together in societies. The only reason that we dominate the world is that we have been so efficient at organizing societies. All right, we kill each other as well, one group against another. But nevertheless, I think that is that's the sort of fascist thinking trope to say. It's, the ultra sort of Andrew Tate view of the world. You get out there and you eat what you kill, and it's every man for himself. And I just don't think that's how people think and feel. I don't think that's who we are. I think there is a very, very strong social impulse, and it is for politicians to draw on that and to draw out the best of that. I mean, of course, we all have two sides of our brain, one which says, me and my family first, and the other of which says, I want to live in a good society. And those sides, right and left, if you like, will always be in some contradiction. And wherever you go in the country, in the world, it's always very interesting. If you know nothing about their politics, you immediately sense who is right, who is left. That there is a natural division in humanity, if you like, and in each of us. But I do think that in the end, the pro-social wins, and people are most distressed by people who break pro-social rules. It's rather why they're, people arriving in boats with no outside any kind of legislation is profoundly upsetting to the idea of who we are as a nation.
Thanks. You slightly cheated by answering two questions, but John, I'm going to come to you.
Well, I wanted to answer the selfish question, so I will do so. As someone who's
no one believes in the rules anymore.
As someone who spent a lot of time ringing doorbells and talking to people, I've always been very impressed that they haven't been dominated by social media, that they're not the product of some slick presentation from a political party. They're extremely skeptical, and quite rightly so, about much of what is served up to them. And I don't call it selfish, but they all come out with what matters to them, and that surely is what they should do in a democracy. We're all equal in a democracy. We all have one vote in a democracy. Our vote must count, and votes often have voices, and that's why politicians should go out and engage all the time with people on the doorsteps, and tumbles out of the doorsteps the real live problems where the state is letting them down, the council is letting them down. Some people are very altruistic, so they campaign on the doorstep when you arrive for improving the lives of other people. Most people want improvements in their own life, in their own family's life. Why shouldn't they? And they are very good at treating the visiting councillor or MP as the complaints department, and any sensible MP and councillor knows that that is their number one function, and they need to get a much better response out of many of these public bodies than is normally served up first time round.
Ben.
Well, maybe I should do artificial intelligence. It's exciting stuff. And it'll get me an invite to number 10 if I talk about AI enough.
It might, yeah.
I think Zennials, I'm the parent of an 18-year-old and a 15-year-old, so I'm very aware of the conversations that are going on among teenagers, and this links to 2 points that were made about dissatisfaction with democracy. And many of you who have teenagers will know that in school elections, Reform did really well around the country. They often came second in the school election, and certainly they did far better than the Tories. So I don't think this recent kind of surge of polling that shows support for reform-like entities among the young is false. I think there is something going on that's going on in Europe too, and I do think that is in part because of TikTok and the better. It's not that TikTok is misinformation so much as people like Nigel Farage are really good at TikTok. Like, that's your first order reasoning for why that's going on. But I think there is a kind of more concerning side of this, which is a kind of turning away from democratic mainstream parties and the establishment by the young, and maybe that's what happened in the 60s. I don't know, I'm not quite old enough to know that. But it does feel that there's a reaction to looking for something else. And this is where we use artificial intelligence for everything else, including apparently homework for so many children. Why not for this? Why not, in the same way that Netflix as an algorithm figures out what kind of cultural products you like, why isn't there an algorithm for voting? Now, I'm not saying that I really don't want to extract humans from the process of governing ourselves as humans. That seems to me like an outcome we want to avoid. But that logic is something you do hear among teens, which is, well, why is this any different to the way in which we use these algorithms to make other choices in our lives? So, for those of us who care about democracy being done of the humans, by the humans, for the humans, then we need to actually address that question head on.
All right, and finally, Polly.
Am I left with the polyocracy question?
You are.
So I'm sure your Greek is all good enough to know that poly means many. Though also poly may be an old Walloon word for girl, which is why parrots were called poly, by Walloon pirates. Here is an obscure fact you didn't expect to learn tonight. I think it's so fascinating to hear John talking about, you know, a member of the legislature as the complaints department. And, you know, I've been involved in Liberal Democrat leaflets about bins and potholes enough to know that, like, transactionally, I get that it works, but what a shitty story to tell to people about their relationship with the state. And I am no longer really a very big fan of Steve Hilton because he was a little bit crazy, but you know, Steve talked about a big society, and these days we talk about mission-driven government, and actually they're trying to talk about the same thing, which is about the mobilization of multitudes. Because the fantasy that the government can take our problems away is a central delusion that has been overpromised to us by politics. Right? You know, social care, right? Just the perennial generational problem. It's impossible to solve because actually social care is as much about how we relate to one another as about how we relate to the state. And the state keeps looking at it with their blinkers on, looking at the 1/3 of caring activity that happens when it's paid for by the state and ignoring the rest, ignoring the mechanisms of the relationships between people, as individuals, the relationship between families, the relationship between communities. You cannot get an appointment for your family at the GP. You cannot get an appointment for your family or your key relationships when you are looking for work, even though most people find work through their friends and family. The state only engages with us as individuals. It does nothing to build our activation as citizens. And that is the problem, right? And so it's not just about a democracy, I'm totally going with this, by the way, which is what is the collective we. But if you wanted to have a polyocracy, you would have to identify the fact that we all have jobs to do, to support each other, to engage with one another. And unless we get to that, whilst we continue promising that the state, by just in return for you paying your taxes, which is really not very much, will fix all of your problems, we will perpetually underdeliver on behalf of the state. And that's when the people who are making impossible promises, frankly, they're just competing against another bunch of people making impossible promises as well, and you can't tell the difference.
Okay, pluralism is dead. Long live pluralism. Thank you, everyone. Go upstairs, get a drink.